had any periods of sobriety?
There were certainly stretches of time when he seemed better. There were days and weeks there were stretches of time when he was better, and I couldn't tell you dates, but there were stretches of time when he was better, and more often not.
As the business manager, you would have been responsible for paying Dr. Kipper's expenses. Is that correct?
Correct.
Can you recall approximately how much per year Mr. Depp spent on Dr. Kipper and his staff?
I think the fee was around $100,000 a month.
Describe for me what you observed of Mr. Depp engaging in what you would call erratic behavior.
What I mean are a variety of ways in which responses to things seem disproportionate to the things. And so, there were times when he would be upset about something, and he would be very, very, very upset about something, seemingly to me disproportionate to that something. Again, erratic is a funny word. I felt like things were less predictable. I felt like I was, I guess, professionally in a place where I never knew day to day what to expect.
You said that Mr. Depp was sometimes his responses seemed to be disproportionate and that he would be very, very upset. What, if any, observations did you make about Mr. Depp expressing anger?
When he was angry at someone, he would let them know. Was that sent in my direction? Very rarely, but at times, certainly on a handful of occasions in 2015. But if he was upset at a contractor, he would vent. If he was upset with a security person, he would vent. He would, he seemed to become increasingly less filtered and increasingly the notion of I want to answer you accurately. People moderate their behavior. They may moderate their behavior in public because things are, inappropriate in a particular setting. People may be upset with an employee, but they're constrained in how the employee is chastised. My experience was that Mr. Depp became increasingly less constrained, less concerned with whether he was going to upset someone's feelings, or just increasingly comfortable venting in an aggressive way when he was upset or disappointed about something.
And did that increase over time, beginning, I think you said around 2010?
It began to change in about 2010, and it increased over time, and increased to the point where our relationship began to be impacted in 2015 and was eventually obviously severed in 2016.
When Mr. Depp would express his anger and upset, did he use profanity?
Sure.
Did you observe any increase in Mr. Depp's expressions of anger and upset associated with any increase in financial difficulties or having to discuss financial difficulties?
Yes. His financial circumstances in 2015 had reached a point where I was extremely concerned and was on a very, very regular basis expressing that concern. And it seemed as I increased my level of expressing that concern, there was anger directed in my direction. And so my warnings in 2015 that we were in very dire financial circumstances were not met very favorably.
So did there come a time that you observed as Mr. Depp's business manager that his spending habits became more increased, perhaps excessive, extravagant?
Yes.
And when did you observe that? When did that begin?
In the time frame I've described in that 2010 and on time frame, as I recall, income was very significant. Spending was very significant. And the spending levels had grown very, very, very large, and required that level of incredibly high income to be maintained. And when it dropped off, the disconnect became untenable.
And what, if anything, did you say or do to try to assist Mr. Depp in curbing that spending?
Those conversations were constant.
And were Nathan Holmes, Kevin Murphy, and Stephen Duders part of the $300,000 a month full-time staff?
Yes.
Okay. Do you know roughly how much each of them were paid?
It's been a long time. If I had to guess, Kevin Murphy was probably paid about $250,000 a year, and Stephen and Nathan probably about $125,000 a year.
Do you know how much Jerry Judge was being paid by Mr. Depp as a security guard?
We paid Jerry by the day. I think Jerry made something like $10,000 a day.
Did Mr. Depp spend any money on charities?
Some, not very much.
And approximately how much?
No specific recollection.
Less than $50,000?
I don't recall writing large charity checks. It was more his style to show up at an event or sort of lend his name to something rather than write checks.
Mr. Mandel, did Mr. Depp ever acknowledge that he needed to change his spending patterns and improve the situation?
Yes. At various times when we would have these conversations, he would acknowledge that he understood what was being communicated and would make expressions of a commitment to sort of work with me to do what was necessary.
And were there occasions that Mr. Depp would apologize and say he was going to do better?
That happened on occasion, yes.
And what, if any, observations did you make about whether Mr. Depp ultimately did improve and work with you to try to get his spending under control?
That never seemed to happen. And so there would be, at times, expressions of appreciation, expressions of an understanding, expressions of a willingness to do what was necessary. But there never seemed to be any follow through when the things would be, teed up that had to happen to make those, words real. There was no follow through.
Now, let's talk about the tax returns for a moment. Did you and TMJ file tax returns on Mr. Depp and his company's behalf while you were his business manager?
Yes.
Are you aware that Mr. Depp testified under oath that you did not file his tax returns for 17 years?
I'm aware that you're telling me.
Is it true that you did not file his tax returns or those on behalf of his company for 17 years?
No, that's not true.
Were there times that you were unable to pay some or all of Mr. Depp's taxes on time? What is your understanding of what or his numerous other vices meant?
The use of alcohol and drugs.
Do you know how much Mr. Depp spent on prescription drugs during the time that you were his business manager?
There were periods of time when prescription spending was, from just my experience, very high, thousands of dollars a month, but I can't tell you the time periods.
Do you have a recollection of whether TMG had to pay for property damage at other rental properties or hotel properties that Mr. Depp used because of damage to the property?
Specifics, no, but did we pay damages at various times over the years? Absolutely, yes.
And do you recall that Mr. Depp from time to time did commit property damage in the rentals that he was in or hotels? And you recall that there were times you did have to pay for damage to Mr. Depp's rentals, is that correct, or hotels?
There were times.
Okay. Now, you had testified a little bit earlier about needing $25 million by the end of the year. Are you aware of whether Mr. Depp was able to sign on for any movies and obtain $25 million by the end of the year without the assistance of a lending entity? So the first time that you as the business manager were unable to pay Mr. Depp's taxes by October 15 was October 15, 2015. Is that correct?
Correct.
And you consider that to be an increasingly difficult and alarming situation that you were trying to resolve into late January 2016. Is that correct?
That's correct.
I showed you earlier exhibit number 8, which was the video clip of Mr. Depp slamming doors and pouring wine, etc., in the kitchen. Do you recall that video?
I recall the video, yes.
Okay. Do you have a recollection of giving Mr. Depp very bad news the morning of February 10, 2016?
I don't recall a specific meeting with a specific date. As I've indicated, there were a variety of meetings in groups and conversations alone and in groups regarding how these very dire financial circumstances were going to be addressed. And as I've indicated, the tone of these conversations became more tense as time went on, and these issues were not being addressed.
And is it fair to say in the first half of February of 2016, the conversations that you have just described were taking place?
Probably even more specifically, Mr. Depp and I began having conversations that took on a more heated turn in July of 15, when it became clear that he was not willing to sell the property in the south of France. And the tone of those conversations became more heated and more contentious as time went on because the circumstances were more dire.
And would it be fair to say that your perception was that the circumstances continued to become more dire between July 2015 up through the time of your termination in March 2016?
They did.
How did you learn of TMG's termination?
Edward White had a colleague, an employee, a CPA, someone in his office came to our office physically and hand-delivered a letter.
And who was the letter from?
I think they hand-delivered like one letter on the 15th and one on the 16th. So there was a letter signed by Mr. Depp indicating that our services had been terminated. And then there was a letter from Edward White's office, I recall, saying that they were the new people and we should coordinate a transition.
Did you have any familiarity with Edward White as of the time of the termination?
I had not heard of him.
And did Mr. White accept your offers of assistance?
For the most part, no.
Now, approximately how much did Mr. Depp earn during the period of time you represented him?
I recall the amount being reported to be something like $600 million, and believe that amount was probably, close to that.
Did you steal $650 million from Mr. Depp?
No.
Did you steal anything from Mr. Depp?
No.
Mr. Mandel, did TMG or you take any money other than the fees that you were entitled to from Mr. Depp?
No.
Mr. Mandel, were you ever found adjudicated by any court, any kind of legal entity, any agency to have committed malpractice, malfeasance, or embezzlement?
No.
All right, well, we'll go ahead and take our morning recess at this point. All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's take our morning recess. Do not discuss the case and don't do any outside research, okay? Thank you. Again, court is still in session, if we could. Court is still in session. Thank you. Thank you. All right, we'll go ahead and take a